about doing this interview for a very, very long time. When Noah sent me the tape, the eulogy of Uncle Jack, that really crystallized the fact that I wanted to make sure I had something of you that was very special. Today is November 24th. We've had a lovely time already. Your daughter Simone is here. Your son-in-law Jerry is here. Your granddaughter Kathy is here. Your son Noah is here. Your niece Risa is here. Her fiance is here, Sam. And your grandnephew Joey is here.
How lovely.
And everyone is here because we love you.
Thank you.
And that is our reason to be here. And your strength and your talent and your charm and your spirit is really why this meant so much to me. So I thought maybe we'd spend a little time tracing back the family history and then later on more specifically with you. And if you take the idea, I am myself a book, which is what you are. And we begin and we fold back the pages. And I see you have a picture of your grandparents there. I thought that was a nice place to start. Tell me about them.
They were, I remember my grandfather and grandmother with a great deal of love. I spent a great deal of time with my grandpa, although it was a very short time, about 6.5 years. I loved him dearly and just enjoyed every minute. My grandmother was a spirited woman who did a lot of wonderful things.
What's their names, Grandma?
Her name was Naomi, and his name was Joseph. Mm-hmm. They were two fine people. The name was Coco.
And what years were they born, Grandma, so we can set this in time?
Well, I have to go back 70 years for them. That was, that's now, it must be 100 and something, I don't know.
Well, they were born where? Where were they?
One was born, both of them were born in, what do you call it, Minsk. That's Russia.
Right.
And they came here with my mother. Their other children had come before them.
I see.
But they had to flee because my grandfather not only did wonderful things, but he also was like a notary. And he would keep the young Jewish boys out of the service. And it got to a point where they caught up with him and they had to leave.
So this was in Minsk that he did this, Grandma, right?
Yes. Simona, do you have anything to say?
I have a story about that my grandmother, mother's mother, Sadie, told me when I was a little girl. She said that one of her earliest memories, and she must have been maybe 7 years old, was there was a time when she would wake up in the night because there would be noise in the house. And often there would be young people in the house, a man, sometimes a woman, and they would be gone in the morning. And it seems that my great-grandparents' house was a stop on a sort of underground railway to smuggle young Jewish people out of the country when they were in danger. The reason that they would be in danger in the first place is going into the army in those years was not like going into the army here, which is a hitch of 2 or 3 years. You went into the army there, it was 25 years. It could be your lifetime. It was part of the Russian effort to eradicate differences in people, and particularly Jews. So there was every effort made when military service was imminent to smuggle young people out of the country. My grandmother also told me of one particular night when she woke up and there was a young woman and a young man in the house. And they got a rabbi and they married these two young people right in the house in the middle of the night, and they were gone in the morning. She doesn't know if they even knew each other before, but they were going to be traveling. They were going to be smuggled out together, and so they married them to make it proper. When my great-grandfather fled, it was because the authorities had gotten on to him.
Yes. But it's very interesting what you just said about my grandmother and grandfather. They continued that practice of helping young people get married in this country. Most of the young people came alone, and they had no one. But the Jewish people got together and helped them. They would set them up. It was a wonderful, wonderful time for them.
So, Grandma, during the time that your grandfather was doing this, was this like the 1880s, the 1870s?
Oh, yes.
When was it that he had to help these young
They
people?
came here about 1899. And I think they came even earlier than that, because I remember my mother came as 8 years old or 7 years old or whatever the age.
In what year, Grandma?
It must have been in the early 90s, because my father came here in 1888, 89, because there was a blizzard in 88, where his brothers were here. My father, my mother, my grandparents, I'll go back to them. My grandfather was a butcher, and he had a butcher shop on Prince Street, which was the center for Jewish people. In Newark. They came to Newark because their children, their other older children had settled here and must have either bought them or they came prepared to live here.
So, Grandma, which children came over first? You're talking about Naomi and Joseph.
Well,
right?
yes.
So which
I
of the
don't know
children
the
came to
exact. I
settle?
have a feeling that Jake and the Tantanahama came early, because
They were the oldest?
well, no, Tantanahama was among them, but she didn't come until after this First World War. So the others came, like David came
In the
I
late
guess very
1800s?
before my parents came. My uncle died, and my mother came with her mother and father.
And that was the late 1800s that they
Yes,
came.
yes.
Mother, who came in 1886 and then...
My father's brothers Simon and Daniel,
Wasn't
and they
there-
were in New York, and they
So this
stayed.
is the Levy side.
Yes.
That's the Levy side, that's the other side
That's
of
the
the
other
family.
side.
Well, they
You're
all
talking about
came
the
in the
Cook
early. They all
side.
came early because they were here long before my grandparents came. They settled here. My grandparents were the last to come with my mother of that family.
On the Cook side.
On the Cool side. We'll get to the Levy side because there's a wonderful story that I want to
And
remember.
my grandmother and grandfather had this butcher shop, and I had cousins, second cousins, who were older than I was. My mother had nieces and nephews older than herself, so that we would all gather at my grandmother's, the butcher shop. Right behind it was this tremendous room, and it must have been opened, or it may have been a couple of rooms, but when I knew it was one big room, and there were like posts that probably were part of the building. And I think there may have been 15 or 16 grandchildren, great-grandchildren gathering. And my grandmother was always busy preparing something for us or for the butcher shop.
Did they live behind the butcher
They
shop?
lived behind, and they had rooms upstairs. And they had, most of the time, living went on downstairs because this is where everybody came, and it was a huge place. And my grandmother, she was terrific, because I remember her very dearly for a long time. We must have driven her out of her mind. The 15 of us racing around that day, round the posts, and she after us. I can just see her thinking, my goodness, what she had to contend with when we were all young, but she was wonderful. My grandfather, she was a more dynamic, outgoing, if you say, now you stop it or something. My grandfather was more gentle. He would be quiet, and he would always go over, pat your head or something like that.
This is Sadie's side of the family?
Yes.
Okay.
This
Your mother-
is my grandfather, Joseph.
Mother, was there a story about your grandmother used to have a little, a cache full of pennies? Is that a story that you want to
Yes,
tell
there's
us?
a story, but this goes on when we were, you mean with pennies?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a famous story. I was always friendly with my boy cousins. There was Harry Levy, and there was Willie Ogans, and I think it was Harry Ketchen. And we always knew Grandma and Grandpa had this bag of pennies. So we went up and helped ourselves to a bunch of money, not asking. And we went on to town. Now, that's a long time ago. And we spent whatever we could, and we must have been gone all day. We came home each with a bunch of pennies. I know I hid mine under a dresser. Well, of course, they found out about it. We were either sick, we must have been sick from the things that we consumed. And my grandma and grandfather, of course, we were all taken and cautioned and said, you don't take money. And this was a lesson for all of us. And of course, my grandparents were wonderful about it, but our parents were just beside themselves. They were so upset. But it was a wonderful time with these three cousins that I had this little rendezvous with them. It was really wonderful.
Grandma, on the Kugel side, are all the children that you've mentioned, Nahama,
Yes.
and Heike, and Jake,
Heike.
and Jake, and Pesha, and David, and Sadie, are they all living in Newark now? Is the whole...
Yes, they were all, no, except Heike.
Except
Tante
Heike.
Heike didn't come over till after the First World War.
I see.
She
So
had
she was
visit-
back in Minsk by herself?
Wait, she came
She's the
over
oldest.
for a visit to the family, where one of my cousins was born in America. She was pregnant at the time. Then they went back. It happened that their husband was a very wealthy man at the time. He traveled over selling, I don't know just what product he sold, but he used to go all over Europe. So they happened to be very comfortable there. But they did come. They had a terrible time coming here.
So Heike was the oldest, right?
No.
She was married and stayed with her
Yes.
family in Minsk.
Yes, yes,
And she had children in Minsk.
yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
There was only one.
And
who
she
was
came
born
later.
here.
But the other children had all
They were all
gone.
here.
And okay, so we're...
I remember.
And everyone was in Newark, is what
Yes,
I
everyone
asking.
was in Newark. And what was wonderful,
So the 15 running around are all the children of these
Yes.
aunts and uncles who are
and
all
cousins,
in
second
Newark.
and
Yes.
nieces and nephews, because I had second cousins, and these were great grandchildren of my parents.
That's because Sadie was the youngest of 13 children. So she had nieces and nephews older than
Much older, much more. My mother had nieces and nephews whose children were older, and my father had the same thing, because he was the
So
youngest.
your mother, our grandmother was
Was the youngest
of the 13.
And my grandfather loved her so dearly that when we were born, we were given such love from both of them. But he transmitted, when my brother Dave was born, he carried him around, and he only lived a year after that, year and a half after that. And I remember his dying. I was in the room. I didn't even fear, because I loved him so much. I was told that he was going to go to sleep, and that was it. He said his prayer, the prayer that people say before they
Shema.
die.
They say Shema.
Yes. And he closed his eyes, and that's all I remember. But I do remember my grandmother after that. She was a very independent person. She refused to live without her parents. So she had her own apartment in Spruce Street in Newark.
This is your grandmother.
My grandmother, she
So this
stayed
is
by
Naomi.
herself, Naomi. She decided that she wanted to be by herself, very independent woman. I remember,
What happened to the butcher shop? Did that
Oh,
close?
that
or
sold.
That sold.
well, my grandfather, the reason he was 70 when he died, he had been kicked by a horse. At that time, there was only horses.
Right.
And due to that accident, he passed on. We just couldn't.
Oh.
She lived to be 86, so she may have been a year younger, so I had knew my grandmother for a long time, until almost when I was growing up till 16 years old, or 15 years old, so it was a long time. She spent a lot of time with our family. The only thing she didn't like where we lived, my father liked things of quiet places. He liked to live where it's quiet and get his excitement out of where he lived. So we had this lovely home, I remember on South 10th Street near Clinton Avenue, and she had a room for herself, and she would come and visit, and then my Monday morning or Sunday morning, Monday morning, my father would come down, found the front door open. My grandmother had left. She decided it's enough of this quiet. And she would do
Where
that.
did she go, Grandma?
She would come on a bus. She never spoke a word of English to us. I'm always sure she knew English because she got on the Clifton bus from Prince Street, whatever it was, and got to Bergen Street and walked up to South 10th Street.
So that was the Kugel side of the family. Okay. Now, you want to go to the other side of the family, the Levy side of the family.
My father.
When did they come over?
Yeah.
And I understand from Simona that it definitely was not Levy.
No. My father and his mother.
Is that right?
There's a story about that we can get to.
My father and his mother and a sister, Yetta, came over together. She brought them to New York. To his
So
oldest.
it's David who came over, right?
No.
No. It was, her name was Sophie.
Let's talk about the name of his great-grandparents.
Yeah.
This was Sophie and David. That's where David comes from.
And when was the year about?
Well, my
Late
father
1880s?
came in 1889.
Okay.
His brothers were here before. They had settled in New York and all around, mostly in New York City. The brothers had left New York in 1888 because they found it too noisy for them and too built up. So one went down toward Texas and the other headed for California.
But that means that David and Sophie, the parents, would have had to have come.
They didn't.
Before
The
that.
grandfather was dead.
Oh, I see.
He had died long before.
David had died long before.
Yes.
So it's only Sophie.
Just Sophie came. She came to bring them here
I
to
see.
her daughter who had a place in New York, who was among the oldest.
Which daughter?
I think it was Nahum. I can't remember her
So
name
this
exactly.
is your father's
Sister.
Grandpa's parents we're talking about, right?
Well, Grandpa's parents,
No,
father
just his
died
mother.
long before they
Okay,
came.
the grandpa.
They
Okay.
So just Sophie, his mother.
Mother
lived.
came
Okay.
and brought Yetta and my father.
Okay.
My father at the time was 10 years old and Yetta was 12 because there was a 2-year difference.
That was the picture we have next to you.
Yes.
It's right next to you. Okay. Whoops.
Right, yes.
So that one is.
That's the one.
Grandpa when
Hold
he's
that, Mother.
just 10.
Why don't you hold that, Mom? We'll see what we can do about. See if we can.
She can bring it closer.
Can you get it?
Yeah, we were
So
doing it.
that's
We're
when
doing
they
it just
came
fine.
over.
Turn it toward Catherine.
That's fine. That's fine.
Grandma, can you turn
Okay.
it towards me for a moment?
Okay.
Can't get too close, but we can see it.
Now her name is Sophie.
Yes.
Okay, and she's your grandmother on your
My
dad's
father's side.
Okay. And that's his sister Yetta. And,
Yes. Now, Grandma didn't stay here. She went right back because she had a daughter with children in Białystok. So that was, I never knew her because my father was.
So Sophie went home, is what you're saying.
And that family came from Białystok?
Yes. The family were bakers in Białystok.
Did they originate the Białystok?
And they were all singers.
They originated
They were all
Białystok
singers
and
in that family. They all sang.
Oh.
They were in choirs and everything. And, you know, it was really interesting.
Were they very religious?
No, no.
Explains a lot, doesn't it?
So Grandma, Yetta and
Yetta
Louis
came.
were here.
Yetta
Were
came
the other
and stayed
children
with,
already here?
stayed with his sister, his older sister who had
In
children.
Newark?
No, New York City. They
In
came
New
to New York.
York City, okay.
That family were in New York.
Okay, so Grandpa stayed with Yetta.
When my father came, his brothers had preceded him. And so when they came to Ellis Island, they had heard that the names were changed so radically, they decided they were Levites, so they took the name of Levy. The real name was Malchakovich. And so my father took the name of Levy, and that's how the name of Levy came down.
And the others also had
All
already
taken the name, all the brothers that came. I only knew Daniel and Simon. I don't know about any other brothers. Those are the two brothers I knew.
Were they living in New York, Grandma, the other
At the-
brothers? Or you don't know?
Who?
The other children? other than?
I don't know, and
Okay.
that part of the family is just vague to me, because
Mhm.
don't forget, they were so much older than my father. One brother, Simon, was 30 years older than he was.
Yeah.
I'd like to say that Louis, my grandfather, was also the youngest of 13.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
Wow.
They were both youngest. And they settled, my father settled in New York, lived with my aunt, and then Yetta got married. That's Yetta. Yetta was what we call the miniature size of my father's family. They were tall and 6-footers. There was a Daniel who was a 6-footer, and there was my father who was just a moderate height.
And Yetta looked like a
Like a
little,
little Matt cameo.
yes, a little Dresden doll.
She was. And she got married, and she was, because of her size, she cooked in pots this big. And my father was a sturdy, solid young man who had a good appetite. He found living with her was too much, so he probably went back to live with his other sister for a while.
What kind of work did he do?
He went to work in a factory because they had to work. He had no other income. He worked at a factory, and how he came to Newark was eventually he heard that there were many more factories in Newark, and that he would have a better chance in Newark.
Grandma, is this already the 1900s that you're
Yes,
talking about?
yes,
Okay.
yes. And
How old was he when he came here, Mom?
he was 10 years old when he came.
In
And what is-
1889.
In 89, he was 10.
He was
Okay,
10.
so he was born in 1879.
That's right.
And what kind of factory did he go to work
Well, he
in?
went to work in a men's clothing factory, more or less, but that's what they had. They were making...
Now, was
men's-
he 11 or 12 when he was working?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, he had to go to work. And he worked for a long time, and when he found out, I think he must have been 17 or 18, maybe 19, when he found out he could do better in New Jersey, he came to Newark. How my parents met, they never really told us. There must have been a circle of Jewish people who got together. They were lived in certain sections, and my father probably had to room somewhere, and they were always trying to have young people meet each other. So
I have the wedding picture, their wedding picture next to you. What year were they married in?
that was 1900, I
Why
think.
don't you show that to me, Mom? That picture, just hold it straight up towards me.
1900?
Hold it straight.
That would have made him 21. Is that right?
And
Yes.
These are your
He
parents,
was
Grandma?
21 when he got married.
Okay, then that was 1900 that they got married.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And they were the youngest of their family. They were the lively ones. They were mostly connected, not with their sisters and brothers. The only one I remember my mother would be friendly with was Tante Pescher. She had Mary and the whole group of them.
So where did they live when they were in Newark?
Well, when
When
I
they first got married?
This is
they
Sadie and Louis.
They lived in
Right,
some
whose
flat.
picture we
What
just
I
saw?
re-
Yes,
Exactly.
the picture we just saw was Sadie and Louis.
Yes.
That was their wedding picture.
Yes.
We estimate that to be in the year 1900.
It was the 19.
Okay.
Kath, I'm Sadie and Louis.
And Louis.
Louis, right?
Yeah, Sadie and
Everyone
Louis.
called him Louis.
Yeah,
Grandmother
my
was
mother called him
Louis.
Louis. It was interesting. My father and mother both. First of all, my grandparents must have made the wedding like they made everything. And she told me that they had a hall, and they would have cooks come in, and they would cook, and the tables were set up. Nobody had place cards there. You sat where you wanted with your family or with anything. And the young children had the best time. They would slide all over the place. I think that they really, because I remember going to weddings like that myself when I was growing up. And it was on Court Street where your folks had the store.
Yeah, the other
And
side of my
it
family.
was above, it was
Right.
above, it was called the Mann family.
Oh,
And,
they had a room that people got married in?
oh, it was a big room.
And it was a
wasn't
hall.
It was a
like
hall, it
Clinton
was a
Manor in
tremendous
our day.
hall.
So you're saying that Grandma and Grandpa got married in this man hall?
In 1900.
And what they did was they had women, oldish women, whoever they had, take care of the babies. There was always babies.
Right.
So they had that, and they had cooks there, and they had marvelous times. And there was never that form.
Neither one of them were from very religious families, were they?
No. My grandparents, I remember going, what I do remember is going with my grandmother to the Russian shawl. They used to call the Russian shawl. And as a child, as a very little girl, I disliked the noise of the Orthodox shul. I felt it was very disturbing to me when when they praying and the children running and everybody talking, that from that time on, I just didn't enjoy that. My father never belonged to any formal. He was a socialist.
That was what I was going to ask you. If there was a political bent in the house, what
My
would you say
father,
that it was?
He believed in the family getting together for holidays and all of that, but he didn't believe in any formal belonging to a temple or any of that, because he had an excellent background. He came at 10, but they started to study when they were 3 years old there. They would go to Cheder, and he had a wonderful background. Jack used to feel very upset because he felt that he had so much to give of his background that he expected more from him. It took me a while to get the two of them.
Mother, updating about 30, 40 years, what did Grandpa Levy do on the holidays? Like on Yom Kippur, what would he do?
He would take my sister and my brother Dave, and they would head toward Asbury Park and eat himself full of oysters and lobsters and have the best time, and then come home and sit down to the big festive dinner I made. And Jack would be upset about that. So I finally straightened my Jack out. I said, now you believe a certain way, you've got to respect my father. Because for me, for my own peace of mind, because they had to live together, and it took some doing, but it worked out.
Mother, to go back, you told me that your house, your grandparents' house, or your parents' home, was the first stop for many of the cousins who came over, whose parents sent them over.
All I remember from the time I may have been 2 or 3 years old was people living with us. It was my father's relatives that came from Europe and stayed with us. And then it was my mother, and Nat Snyder, who was Tante Kaiser's son. He was the first one of that family to come. This Nat, went to Philippines and came home to Newark with a monkey, which I remember.
Was he in the Spanish-American War?
No, that was Daniel, my uncle. My father's brother was in the Spanish-American War. And not only that, he had himself an affair with the general's wife.
This was the uncle who left New York in 1888 because it was too crowded.
To go to California, and he joined the army. And he was a wonderful, I remember him coming to us for David's bris. I remember I was just not quite 5 years old. My birthday was...
Is this Daniel or Simon?
Daniel.
This is your Uncle Daniel. So he was a
Simon by
colorful character.
And
references have been made to my grandfather Louis's lack of being religious, and I'd like to place him a little bit in his historical time. Grandpa came from Russia at a time of great ferment, great upheaval, all kinds of political ideas. It was the time of the serfs. The serfs actually literally starved to death. You all remember there was a revolution in 1905, way before the 1917 revolution. Grandpa came out of that young Russian intelligentsia. Those were the ideas that influenced his life and the way that he felt about the world. He was an intellectual man, and he was a politically oriented man.
I remember his whole attitude about that. He would always sit, we would sit and talk, and he would talk about voting and talking about what the person should do. He said, always look into every candidate, he said. Find out what they stand for, what their abilities are. Don't vote party. And it was always, I always think of that when we have any election. I always think of who is there that will fulfill the need of the time. And another thing, my father always, I felt, was he wasn't religious, as you say, a formal religious, but he had a great respect for being as a Jew. And he also felt that the Jew, he asked questions when he was young, and they could not answer him. At the time, he felt that they did not give him the replies that he needed for his kind of thinking. So
You mean
he
the
had to-
rabbis, Grandma, couldn't
Yes,
give him the answers?
any of the religious groups. He felt they did not answer.
There always seemed to me that there was so much, where even though there wasn't the formal religion, there was so much Yiddishkeit in the house.
Absolutely.
That's what I remember, is the Yiddishkeit that was there.
There was
And the freedom of
don't forget,
expression.
we always, there was never any idea of not being a Jew.
Oh, no.
The
Oh,
Jewish
no.
part of it, we were not religious, but we were typically very, very Jewish oriented. Our lives we were brought up to respect our religion. With no formal. I remember myself when I first got married and we joined a temple, that it took me a long time to be able to accept the way it was run and how the people that ran it. I always had my father, I could always feel my father, sure, he said, wasn't people that were capable, only people that had money. But I also learned that you can't run a business without money. So I was able to cope with that. It was always there before me. But I felt that I wanted to give our children a background, so we belonged to the temple, and I became, not religious, I never had, it was very funny, when I first married, I asked Jack if he would want a kosher home. He said no. And long 4 or 5 years, he must have gotten one of those religious moments. And he said to me, would you mind having a religious home? I said, yes. I said, I could not be honest. I said, doing it. I have been brought up a certain way, and I have continued it. I would not be honest, and that was something I could not accept. So it was like
So
that.
religion in your home, when you were little, was handled, as I always think of it, in a Yiddishkeit kind of way, and
yes,
in an academic way?
My home was full of that, but not the formal religious.
Mm-hmm.
I gave our children and
But
the
Grandma,
home.
there was always a culture and a tradition.
I think
that
we-
Well,
permeated
may I go back? May I
Yes.
go back?
Your childhood, Grandma.
My childhood, all I remember from my childhood, and I do remember it with a great deal of love and thankfulness that I have a father and a mother, but my father was very dominant. He loved culture. He loved, as soon as he came, he didn't know how to read and write. During the time when he was working 12 hours a day, they had somebody, a tutor, come in to teach him to read and write.
English.
In English.
Of course English,
He
because
was literate in his own
Right.
language.
yes.
Was he educated, Grandma? Your father?
He was educated in the Jewish background, but my father was an intellect, so that there was a great feeling and a great need for him to know.
But did he go to formal
No, he never had a
schooling
chance.
at all?
Not in the
Even
United
as a very young boy, there was no formal
He had to
schooling?
work.
He went
He
to
did?
Cheder. He went to Cheder.
Cheder, well, that was,
Everyone did.
don't forget, he had 7 years of excellent background.
Okay, so he did go to formal school when he was younger in Russia.
Absolutely. But when he came here, he couldn't. There was
Started to work.
nobody to give him and help him, so he had to work.
This
And he
background.
spoke no English when he came here.
Well, he learned English very fast. I think they were very young, and young children learn the language much faster than older ones.
He spoke Russian and Yiddish, or
My-
Yiddish was
and
his-
Polish.
And Polish.
My mother did too. They knew how to.
All three.
Yes. I remember as we were youngsters, sitting around a table, and he reading the classics to us. We always had that. Not only that, but music. he had a great love for music. It hadn't developed yet into opera, but the opera was there, just music. And I remember from being a very young child going to the opera in Newark, or my father going to New York, to the Metropolitan. He was a great lover. So we were given such a wonderful background that I thought everybody lived that way. That everybody had this marvelous, marvelous chance to learn, but we took it for granted. I remember his telling us stories about his family and how they all loved culture. The only one that my father had very little respect for was Yetta. I don't know, she was a very nice little lady, but he felt although she looked like the family, he thought she was not part of the family.
Which is probably another story.
He was a very hard customer. He couldn't stand anyone that wasn't with it.
He did not suffer fools like me.
They were absolutely right.
Who handled the discipline in the house when you were
My father.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when we were growing up, my father always surrounded himself with statuary from the time I was a little girl. Mm-hmm. He had this beautiful, I remember the blacksmith with a light on a big pedestal. I remember we had mission furniture in our library where there was an Indian stretched out. I can just picture these things. And this gold table this was on Belmont Avenue, a gold table in the center with a beautiful, what he called vase, cut glass vase. And when my parents would go out, we kids would play hide and seek. And many times there was some little accidents, and then my father, the next day, I always said to myself, I hope he whips me and doesn't lecture me. I used to hate his lectures.
Grandma,
Really.
was your mother a soft touch?
She was soft, but she still also was disciplined. But there couldn't be two as strict as my father.
So he was the
But he was, one thing he respected you, if you were honest.
Did you have freedom of expression in the house?
Yes.
See, even with the strictness, I always had the feeling that you
Oh,
were
no,
allowed
no,
to
no.
express
We were
yourself.
brought up, that's a very good point, Teresa. We were brought up to think independently. And that's why four of us were so independent, each individual in our family. We
Mother, tell us about what you were like, and Lila was like, and Davy was like, and Joey was like when you were children.
We want to pick up now with your childhood, the children, how things were in the house, each of the brothers and your sister. So tell us about that, when they were born. Let's get a
Yes.
time fix.
My sister was, are you ready?
Yes, Mom.
My sister was the firstborn. My
Was
mother...
her name Lillian? Was she
No,
the
her
first
name, she was named Sophie.
Oh.
Lillian. But she never liked, as she grew older, Sophie became a horror to her. And she became Lillian. She was
Oh, so she was named Sophie for
that grandmother.
For that grandmother.
And Lila was, my mother happened to have been blood poisoned at her birth. And she was very ill for 6 months, and at a point where they didn't know whether she'd make it. So she was told that she'd never have any more children. And exactly...
What year was that, Aunt Donna?
1901.
Okay.
I'm 1903.
Wait,
So-
Lila was born what year?
91.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
And my mother came through it, but she was told to never have any more children. And within I guess maybe 6 months, she was pregnant, and she wasn't allowed to do very much. And I was born not at home, but at St. James Hospital, which is a very rare thing because of the history of my mother. So then there was a long lapse. And my brother
Excuse me, where
Dave,
was St. James Hospital?
down on High Street, down in Newark.
So you say mostly women gave birth at home.
Everyone
It
gave
was
birth.
very unusual.
And they
to
had
go to the
midwives.
hospital.
This
And you
was
had
a
a midwife.
physician.
Mhm.
We had a physician because they were troubled about my mother and worried about her. But she came through it all right. But I think she was left with some very bad things in her body. Her body must have been disturbed by the poisons that were there. That's why, through the years, she was in bed a lot. David was born.
Mother, what year were you born?
I was born 1903. And there was this lapse of 5 years, and then David was born. I remember the night both Lila and I were huddled together, and we knew things were happening, and we were in this bedroom. The next bedroom, my mother was giving birth to David. And the doctor came out and said to us, after all over, he said, I brought you a brother in my satchel. Of course, that was one of the... And I'll never forget the feeling we had then, the fear we had. You know, the whole thing was nighttime. It was during the night, probably.
Where did you live then?
We lived on Court Street. And I think the next day my father must have been floating on cloud 9. He had a son. And I, all through the years, I always teased him. I told him I was a disappointment. He didn't like to hear that. But that was the time his brother came from California, Daniel, for the bris. And I remember this 6-footer, and I was a little girl, and just not even, my birthday was the next month, and they must have put me to sleep on a trunk or something because there's so many people there. And there was this tall man looking down at me. I thought this was a giant. It was quite an experience, but I always remember him as a tall and good-looking man. And that was the last time my father saw him. His brothers all settled, the entire family settled outside of New York, except this one aunt who had her children. They settled in New York City, and through the years, we lost track of them, as you do. Especially if you're the younger generation, you don't keep up with some of the older ones. So my father would be the one to do that, and he did when we were growing up. I went to see them with him. Then there was a passage of 5 years, but after David was born, we moved to the steam-heated apartment, the first one in Newark, and it was in Beacon Street. I remember the number 40. And
what was it before that? You're saying it was coal heated before
Sure.
that? Sure. And it was an apartment?
I can remember it because I was too little. I was 4 years old.
Grandma, did you and Lila and David all share one room together?
No. Lila and I were together. David was 5 years younger than we were.
No, I knew after he was born, right before you moved.
No, we moved very shortly after that to this place. We didn't probably have enough room where we were. And not only that, when we lived in that what do you call Court Street, the lavatory was out in the hall, shared by two people.
Other families?
There was one other family. And then we used the wash tubs that they had. I don't remember all this, but I knew from seeing, there was no other bathroom there. There was no bathroom per se. And then we moved to Beacon Street, and I remember quite a few incidents there. Growing up, the 4th of July was always a very scary time for us because they would come out with not little what do you call it, pop things or firecrackers, but they came out with guns, really guns, and we were shooting them off. I remember being
in the streets, people would shoot them in the streets?
Just shooting them off, that was the thing. And I remember being on the roof of this. My father took us up to be away from all the excitement. And I remember that very, very vividly. And then I remember my cousin Nat Snyder. He had come from Philippines, and somehow he was driving this tremendous, beautiful car. To me, being a little child, you know, these older cars, with beautiful
What year was that?
This was 1910, or 1909, one of the years. And I remember I'm sitting in this thing, feeling like I was in this huge room. One of the, the old-time cars were huge. And then Nat was part of living, he lived with us, and there were other cousins, my father's nephews, my mother's nephews, and second cousins lived. That's all I knew when I was growing up.
And Grandpa manufactured clothes?
Yes, Grandpa opened, first he worked in a factory as a worker. Then he opened up his own factory. And
Mom, how old was he about?
he must have been in his mid-20s then. And I remember as little girls, Lyle and myself, walking with him. We had already moved to Belmont Avenue. My father was building this house on Belmont Avenue near Clinton Avenue. It was a 3-family house. And I remember walking from there with him he was going to the barber, and he was going to his factory, and we used to walk along in these beautiful navy blue coats that both with pearl buttons, double-breasted, and with these lace collars, but both my mother and father had made for us. And my father walking along proudly with his 2 daughters, meeting people and saying hello, and we always loved it. And then he would go to the barber shop, and then he would go to his factory, and then we would go home. It was always a routine on Sunday.
What was the name of the factory? Was it the family?
It was just Levy, I guess, at that time. Later on, he had, there was Levy and Shartoff. That was the first one. Because the first one that, they were partners in this building, this house on Belmont Avenue. My parents had the 3rd floor, and this was one of those terraced houses. You worked up a flight of stairs before you got on the top of the terrace, and then you worked up a flight of stairs to go to the porch, and then you walked 3 flights to your apartment. But, you know, it was one of those places, I remember that. And after that, my father said he'd never buy a house or be in a house where it had so many steps. But I remember that house with a great deal of affection, because we, in the summertime, we used to sleep out on the porch.
This is Court
That was our
Street,
summer
right?
bedroom.
This is Court Street.
No.
No, this was about, we had moved,
Ah.
we only lived a year in Beacon Street. Because they were building the house and they had to have an apartment. So when we moved in, and we lived there for about, from the time I was 7 or 6 till I was about 14 or 15. And there I went to A1 Avenue School I wasn't allowed to go to A1 Avenue School because our street divided the district. So, which would have been convenient, we had to walk a mile, more than a mile, to go to the other school.
Do you
And
remember the night that Joey was born?
Yes, I sure do. He was born on Belmont Avenue in that house.
And he was born at home?
He was born, all 3 of the others were born at home. And I remember vividly when Joey could. Don't forget, I was 12 years old then.
Okay. Uncle David then is how many years older?
5. There was 5
Okay,
and 5.
5 and 5.
There was a 10-year span there.
No, 10. Weren't you 10, Mom?
What?
How old were you when Joey was born?
12. I forget I was 10 years older than Joey.
No.
I know he was born January 13th, 1913.
So you were 10, Mom, when Joey was born. You were 10.
Oh, 10, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm thinking,
Right, okay, because he was born in 1930.
Lila was
that's right,
12.
10. I'm figuring more years.
Lila was 12.
Yes, that's right. She was
Okay.
But I remember, if I find that picture holding Joey as a little one, he was the
Oh, I'd love to
cutest,
see it.
cutest little boy. From the time he was the tiny little one, he had a certain personality that you could feel. He was he never stood still. He was always running, but he was always a happy little fellow.
Did the same doctor bring Joey in a satchel that brought David in a satchel?
No, by that time, we had grown up a little bit. You know, you can fool kids at once, but not when you're 5 years old, not even 5, that ever go over. But I remember all of ours really having very, very wonderful times there. My father was a great lover of music, so I remember when eventually we got a record player, but that wasn't automatic. So we would, on Saturday afternoon.
How old were you?
Well, by that time I was 14 or 15. And one of us
Joey was only 4 years old.
That's right.
David was 9.
That's
Lila was
right. And
16, a young lady already.
Yes. And I remember we were put in charge of that record player every Saturday. And we had opera all Saturday afternoon, and we loved it. We had to wind it, so that's why we weren't put in charge. It wasn't those automatic things. But
And you were in school. Where were you in school then? You were in high school by that time?
Yes. Yeah.
Where'd you go to high school?
Southside.
Southside High.
And David went He went to sell
Did
something.
Grandma care for the children herself? Did you have...
Oh, yes. We always had help.
You always had help. So the financial picture of the family was...
Well,
seemed to have done
let's
quite
say
well
we
for
were
the
middle
times.
class, maybe not upper, maybe with the lower middle class, but we were
Yeah.
maybe in the middle of it.
Did you have help that lived with your grandma?
Always had help.
That lived with you?
Time living. I remember this one on Belmont Avenue. She was a Jewish young woman who came over, and she was serving, and she had to learn how to serve and know what to do. And the minute you put your spoon in a plate, she grabbed it.
Anxious to please.
My father would just put his spoon down for a minute, and that was gone.
So
I'm sure that
Grandpa
she-
went to work every day, and Grandma stayed home with the children. Did she cook and bake? And was
Yes,
she very
yes,
domestic
yes.
in that way?
She had plenty to do with four of us.
Now,
Although-
at that time when Lila was 16, you were 14, I imagine that the two of you, Lila must have had boyfriends then?
Yes,
You
dear.
had boyfriends then, or
I
you were a
don't
little
remember.
young? Or?
Oh, I did. That was a time when we used to go down to Bradley Beach. We had our home down there.
How did you get to Bradley Beach, Mom?
Huh?
How did you get to Bradley Beach?
Well, first of all, we rented down there. When I was about 12 years old, we started to go. And it's very interesting. I
You
was
walked.
reading a book. It was very interesting. I was reading a book that I just finished. And it had, the car was a Marmon, and that they had from the early years, which they were having in the 1970s. And it was a relic at that time, and everybody wanted to buy it. My father, when he had a car, it was just like, you think it was a Prince that was kept like shiny. I think that car meant more to him than anybody. And he drove it like a maniac.
So
That's
you all
the
went
vision
down
that I
in this
have.
car called a
Marmon.
Marmon.
And what color was it?
That was black. Oh, that time everything was black.
Everything
Mother,
was
and
black.
the roads were good and nice.
Oh, the roads were roads were something to be thought about. You would go for one road, and the next time you came over, you didn't go over that road. They were constantly building, so you never knew where you were going to go.
And how long did it take you to get from Newark to Bradley Beach?
Well, in the early years, it was about an hour and a half or 2
Oh,
hours,
that's not too bad.
because with all the detours and everything, and the roads. But it was wonderful. I remember going down there. First, we rented. My father rented. And I remember being on Newark Avenue in this place. And cousin of my father's daughter's was Simon's daughter. Came from the south, from Dallas. She lived in Dallas. And she came and saw us in bathing suits, and I thought she was going to absolutely, she thought, my God, people are naked here. This is terrible. My father, eventually, she got used to it. He bought her a bathing suit, and she became part of it. She was Dave Levy's sister, the one that I talked about when he came. And that was the first place. Then they rented the second place, but after that, my father bought.
What street was that house on?
That Newark
That you
Avenue was the
bought.
first one, but our home was on 4th Avenue.
My father took me to that home. once.
217 4th
It
Avenue.
was absolutely beautiful.
I know. I love that.
Big porch. and-
Yes, it had an L-shaped porch, and it was a huge. I remember playing croquet there, and it was just wonderful.
Grandma, when you first went down there, did lots of family people come down to join you,
At that
to visit
time,
you at the beach,
at that
or
time, it was beautiful there because there wasn't any rooms rented out like eventually happened. People came. There was two big hotels. One was
Well, the Brindley?
yes.
The Brindley was there for
Was
years.
the Lorraine
No,
open?
there was one.
Lorraine Bradley, I think.
No, there was one. No, this was a big one. I forgot the name of it.
Berkeley
But other-
Carteret.
No, that was Asbury Park.
Okay.
That's a
and
famous
it's still
one.
there, yeah.
That's still there. But the one that was in, I think it was the Manor. It was a beautiful place. But there was a small hotel run by a family that when we used to come down and before we rented, we would stay there. It was a beautiful place. Also a very lovely, lovely place.
And
On one of the streets, may have been 4th or 3rd Avenue, one of those places.
Was there a boardwalk, Mother?
No. When we went down, there was no boardwalk there. You walked to Ocean Grove and got on a sort of a boardwalk. And they did have a walk, but just where they would have a bowling alley. And years ago, when we went down there, they had family teams. We all bowled. This was part of the thing. Every one of us went bowling.
You went
Grandma-
bowling? Oh, that's
Grandma, where
interesting.
did you get gas for this car?
What?
Where did you get gasoline for this car?
Oh, there was plenty of there were plenty of places along. Not don't forget.
Not along the way, really, but once you arrived.
No, there were. Don't forget. Once there were cars, people smart enough to have gas stations. They weren't as often there. You didn't get to them close
Well, I was
enough.
just thinking about these roads that kept appearing and disappearing and wondering how...
But the roads that we were put on always had some place where you could get it. It wasn't as convenient as it is now, but there was there. But
Did
these cars used to take about 24 gallons or 25 gallons.
Mother, your brothers, I know you told me learned to swim there and were very, very good swimmers.
Oh, yes.
And
we all learned to swim in the ocean.
And your brother Joey.
My brother Joey had a wonderful personality, so he sat with all the lifesavers. And there was this Indian. He always, and they used to put a belt around him, and he was always like 2, 3.
What do you mean an Indian?
It was an Indian, huge man who was a lifesaver.
Oh,
He was stunning.
uh-huh.
He was stunning.
Uh-huh.
And he was one that my father went in and he got caught in an undertow. It was this Indian that brought him out.
Oh, really?
And my father never went in after that.
Mother, was there a story about when Joey used to tan a great deal?
Oh.
And there was another
Joey
cousin?
and my mother used to tan right away. The rest of us used to burn. And my father used to have blisters. His skin was white.
He was dark-skinned like your mother, like Diana.
And Lila and myself, the four of us,
Fair.
we would burn.
Mhm.
I learned not to go in the sun that much. When I used to go in, we had an umbrella that time, and the lifesavers used to bring them. There weren't so many people on the boardwalk. On the beach, because the beaches were huge then. You would walk about 50 to 100 feet to go into the water, maybe longer than that. And families would sit, like I was sitting here, you'd be probably in the hall there somewhere. That was the way we would sit.
Was there a story about when Joey one summer got a very deep tan, and there was a little problem when I think your mother had to pull his bathing suit down a little bit to show. You want to tell that story?
There was a difference. He had this little difference I couldn't believe. Oh no, the one story you're talking about is that my Uncle Dave, that's my mother's brother, children all were dark, and they had a law down in Raleigh Beach that the colored couldn't swim in our beaches. So my little cousin walked down whatever it was that time. I was a boardwalk then or whatever it was, and the policeman told me to get off the beach. My aunt, she raised hell.
Mm-hmm.
He was really dark. He got to be like some mulattoes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore they had to pull his bathing suit down to show.
So that's right. It wasn't Joey.
Right.
No,
I thought it was Joey.
No, it wasn't Joey. It was my cousin, Uncle Dave's. I think it was Philly. That was the youngest of the sons.
So my grandfather Louis never went back in the water after the undertow
He
pulled him
hated
in,
the
and he
sun
was
like I
safe.
hated the sun.
But I understand my grandmother swam
My
like a
mother used to swim. You most effortless swimmer I ever saw in my life. She'd go in the water and she would glide. It was like a fish in the water. And she would go down about 6 o'clock in the morning and go swimming, then wait for the fishermen to come in, and we would get the fish. That's when I learned to eat really delicious fish.
Mm-hmm. So she would get the fish after
She
the
would
swim.
get the fresh
She'd get
fish and bring it
the
home,
fish.
and it was really unbelievable. Yeah, listen.
So that's where my father, Joey, really learned to love to swim from his mother.
Your
Right.
father, Joey, was the kind that everybody loved to be with him. He had a personality that everyone loved.
Very outgoing.
Outgoing, and he went into everything. Both Dave and both became excellent swimmers down there. I learned to swim in the ocean. We used to go into the waves. We weren't afraid. We were just brought up on it. That's why when I went, after I was married, we went to that town near you.
Nearby.
And we went to swim in the Hudson River. I will never forget my feet touching that mud, and I said, that's not for me.
Slime. So Bradley Beach was just
Bradley
it's
Beach,
a wonderful.
that was
thought.
wonderful because we had this lovely home and we used to go down. My father used to say to us, say it was November, how about going to Bradley? And
So you used your house
my mother
all
used
year
to
round.
put the blankets, I remember sitting on top of these blankets and we'd go down. He would say 8 o'clock at night, let's go, and we were all piling. We were all that way, ready to go.
Grandpa was a very flamboyant man in
Yes.
a lot of ways. You left off saying that his first partner was a man named Shartoff. Then what did he do in business?
Then he had Fiorito. Then my father had...
Was that in Irvington, right on Clinton Avenue in Irvington, Mother? Because I have a recollection of that factory.
Then he moved down to North Newark, to East
Newark.
East Newark, and was in the old Clark Mills there. He had a tremendous factory also with Mr. Fiorito.
And they did custom work.
They did the coats of contracting.
Contract.
Coats of
Contract,
of the suits.
What happened to that factory?
My
I've
father
heard different stories.
retired. I was delighted because I used to run the books for him. I hated after one.
Well, Grandpa and Mr. Fiorito were partners, Louis Fiorito and Louis Levy, for 40 years, as I understand.
Oh, the long time.
And I also believe that 3,000 miles apart, Mr. Fiorito was in California and Grandpa was in Newark. They died on the same day.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
His son was Ted Fiorito, who was a famous band player at the time. Known at that time. I remember the year, but it wasn't 50s.
I remember he went out to, Louis Fiorito went out to either Vegas or California because Ted had this band and he wanted his father out there. It's time for him to retire. And I believe Grandpa Levy continued to run that for a while after.
No, they didn't.
Then they sold?
They sold it and they retired. What Grandpa did, he didn't want to be home. So he ran a factory for either Hilton Company, that used to be a famous men's clothier. They had factories. My father ran it down. That was in one of the towns not far from here.
Harrison or East?
No. It was the other way down toward south. And he used to go travel with a car out there all the time. And he did that for, many years.
I have a recollection of going to the factory in East Newark with you and used to go there on Fridays to do the books. And I remember standing by the ice cream machine, and everyone would look at me and who are you? I said, I'm Mr. Levy's grandson. Oh, let me buy you an ice cream. I mean, I have this vision of eating a dozen ice creams till my mother then grabbed me aside, put me down, and hoped that I wasn't going to get sick. But everyone wanted to get in good with Mr. Levy's grandson.
I did the books for 150 people there. I ran the payroll and everything for them all those years.
This was done by hand, not computers back in those days.
They didn't have those computers.
Not even calculators.
They had,
And had
Mona
to
will
make
remember, and
practice.
I think you might remember, the old adding machine. One that I
One
used
of
to have
these.
to, no,
Oh, you pushed
I
it
had
up.
to put it up first to the number, then
Yeah,
pull.
then pull.
So, Mother, you worked with your father from the time you were 14 years old, I
Yes,
understand.
yes.
Where was Aunt Lila, Uncle David, and my father Joey while you were working?
Well, Lila was busy with singing. She wanted to be an opera singer.
And where was she living? I was told,
Well,
wasn't
she
living
lived
in Europe?
first she married. I put the names of her husbands there. First she married this man who was a very nice man, this Rattler. But Lila wanted to be an opera singer. So I remember she lived in Brooklyn on Ocean Avenue, something I think.
She lived by herself.
She lived with this husband of hers, supposedly. He was working, and he had an excellent job. He worked for H.C. Bohack, which ran stores, supermarkets like we have. But he was in the office making, at that time, about $350, which is a lot of money.
Sure.
And they had this apartment on Ocean Parkway. That's where it was, Ocean Parkway. I remember coming to visit my sister, and there was Bill Herman, about a half a dozen of others who were studying voice. And the husband would come in, no dinner was ready. This went on. Then she took herself off to Europe for about 4 or 5 months or 6 months while she was married to him with a teacher.
With a singing teacher, and they went to Via Reggio.
Yes. That's right, they went to Viareggio. So, well, not only that, they went to London, and they were in Paris, and they...
And what did your parents have to say about all this?
What?
What did your parents have to say about all this?
Well, who could say anything about it? Lila went her way.
But also my grandfather very much encouraged
Personally,
Lila's
yeah.
singing.
Well, I don't know if he encouraged her to do certain things that she did, but Lila did what she wanted on certain things there. And, well, what happened was, after 3 years...
How old was she when she did this?
I don't know when she got married.
Was she about 18 or 19?
Oh, no, she was a little bit older.
Oh, she was? Okay. I had heard that she was...
I remember telling her
I think she
the
told
night,
me.
a couple of days or a week before she was married, not to marry this man. I said, you're not in love with him, and I don't think you should marry him. And so she said, well, I guess Lila's attitude, so what, I'll get married.
That's in keeping. And where was your brother David? And you were working...
Well, David was
Was he
growing
in
up
school?
at that time. He was 18, he was still in high school, and your brother and your father was, I think at that time, either finishing grade school or going into high school. And David was starting, and I'm trying to think, David was, I know we helped David to go to the University of Pennsylvania, Lila and myself, the first year. And
You
he
helped him financially?
At that time, my father's factory, there was a very bad year. They had strikes and things like that. And that time, I was married. And I earned money. I still worked after I got married for a while. I ran some books for some money. And we gave him a certain amount. It was easier then, of course.
Right.
But after that year, he figured that it wasn't right for us to do it. So we came here and went to law school down in North. And he was able to cope with that.
And my father
And your
is 5
father-
years younger.
Well, your father
the
didn't
baby.
want to go on to college.
To college. He went to high
He
school.
went into business and he was in everything. I remember the gum that he used to bring.
Yeah.
What, blackjack gum? Was it the
No.
liquid gum?
No, it was.
When I was a little girl, my Uncle Joey, Reese's dad, had a car with a rumble seat. And he would come to visit us, and the car was always full of tea-berry gum.
That's it.
Which was the brand of chewing gum that he was selling.
I have vivid recollections of that too, tea-berry gum.
And we would chew 5, 10, 15 slices at a time.
Who was he
of
selling it
tea-berry
for?
gum.
But
I
you
guess
know-
for the company.
Oh,
I mean,
oh,
it was
I
a
want to
sales-
tell you, your father was a marvelous, marvelous uncle to these children. He would come and sit for me. He was the kind that it was wonderful with them. He knew how to be with them. He knew how to play with them. He knew how to also discipline them. And he had to discipline. He had a Naomi, when he was taking care of her, she did crayon in the back of her headboard. And the something wasn't removable crayon that time. It was, he did, I remember,
Wanna take this?
and your bad points.
You want to tape this, Mother?
Well, just
No.
hold it among...
No.
I just wanted to ask you a couple things
Yes,
about
please.
my own dad. About, did you say you took care of him?
Yes,
He adored you and...
Well, I adored him from the time he was little. He was the cutest and a wonderful child. And he was
Did you
kind
take
of...
care of him?
Oh, yes, I did. I liked to be with him. I liked to take him with me. And I never felt he was a burden. Only time I felt my brother Dave was a burden when we were up in the mountains. Joey wasn't born yet. And I met my first sweetheart. And I was 12 and a half and he was 16. And my mother's voice would come at, she called me Annie, come take care of Dave. I wanted to choke her.
And him?
But
That's true.
this was Bibb Ushing's brother.
Uh-huh.
That was a relationship of which we, for years and years, that we remained friends, and I was her bridesmaid when she was married and all that. But it was the families that met up at the farm. You know, years ago, the farmer used to have the landslide come. That's how these places up at Catskill started.
Right.
People from the same area would come there. So your father was a wonderful child. I found him.
Did he like sports and...
He was very active. David was more sedentary, and he would sit more. He tended to a little bit of weight, my brother David. Joey was always wiry, and he was like a little wiry thing all the time, and he was constantly moving. And I enjoyed him. I always had such fond memories of him growing up.
It seems each of the children have such a love for music and the arts, and it's been passed on to all of us, which is such a nice
well,
thing.
That's very normal because that was part of our growing up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
My father loved music. He loved opera the most. The symphonic he liked, but that was secondary to the opera. He was really an opera buff.
What about your own interest in voice, in art, in piano? I mean, all the things.
Well,
that
I was
did.
always interested.
I know.
Don't you see, I couldn't help but be interested in art. My father collected things. We always had things. It was like we were part of that thing. It just carried on. And I remember, I always wanted to sing. But my sister had the better voice. That I accepted. But it didn't stop me from wanting to sing, and I did. Of course, I played the piano and loved that. But I think we all had that inner feeling for art in any form. It was part of us. It was part of our souls, really.
When did you meet Uncle Jack? And how?
Well, we were down in Raleigh Beach. It was the summertime. And he came down in a bus. I was 12 and a half then, 12 or 13 and a half then. And he came on the beach with the family. They were married to, Nat Ogans was married into that family, the Gold family. There was a physician in that family. And they came down, one of the Nat's brother-in-laws ran one of the first buses that were independent buses on Springfield Avenue. At that time when the buses started, that wasn't a company like the public service. They were run separately. They were independent ones. And this was a huge bus, so he did very well in it. So they came down with a whole group of them to Bradley Beach, and we all met on, I guess they came to us because we were down there. And that's when I met Jack. And after that, I would see him, say hello to him, somehow there was a contact. I remember my 16th birthday. He was invited to my 16th birthday. I don't remember him then. It was too quiet for me then. There were others there, but I always, after...
Was it at the house? You had a party at the house?
This was my sister made the surprise party, and my girlfriend, it was during the week that I never knew it was a surprise party.
At the
My
house.
friend Grace came up, and which was a rare thing for her to come midweek. I said, I'd like to go to the movies. I looked at her like she was crazy. So we get to the movies, we're there about a half an hour, she said, I gotta go home, I forgot something. So she said, I'll walk you home. She lived down on Washington Street, I lived on Belmont Avenue, she had to take a bus home. So we got home, we walked up the steps, and suddenly the door was opened and they hollered surprise. I was so shocked, it was like, I didn't know where I was for a moment, but it was a really surprise, but I don't remember him being there. I know he was there, because he was invited. Then there was a long interval. I would see him occasionally. We would get in touch. And then he started writing to me when he went to college. And he worked in the summers in order to have money for tuition. And he would write, he'd be at Grand Hotel up in Green Mountains or somewhere, High Mountains somewhere. And I got these wonderful letters. And then in his last year in college, he started to come very seriously. And that was at the end of that, he was invited, he took his state boards, and I invited him down for a long weekend in Bradley Beach. It was a 4-day weekend. And that was when, we never declared, we just became sweethearts. And I remember walking on the boardwalk, that's when they had the boardwalk. They didn't quite have the boardwalk in Bradley Beach yet. So we walked to Ocean Grove and walked into Asbury Park, and the night was gorgeous, and the stars were out. And I always remember that as just floating along. It was such a beautiful, beautiful evening. And from that time...
And what year was that?
Oh, that was 1920.
23 is when he took
No,
the state boards.
23 when he graduated. No, 23.
Is when he graduated.
Yeah, he.
Yes.
But I said it was, I'm trying to think, yes, it was in 23, because we didn't get married until 26. It was a long
engagement.
First of all, he had to work money to open his office. And then, in order for us to get married, we had to live in back of the office, the 3 rooms that they had. And we made this ugly little place into a lovely little place. It was an old place. I never forget going down, we had separate heaters going down to the cellar that I think, I never was frightened of cellars, but this one gave me the heebie-jeebies.
It was 1926?
Well, we got married in 1926, December.
And where were you married?
At the Clinton Manor.
Which was called the Sherry Manor at that
Yes.
time.
It was called the Sherry Manor at that time.
George
And
Sherry's
it was an afternoon wedding, but I remember the reception better than I do my luncheon. The ceremony was fine, everything was fine, but the luncheon was almost a fiasco. My mother-in-law didn't know that you arrange things and you don't ask 10 more people. And 10 people came, or 11, I don't remember, and somehow it got straightened out and they were taken care of. But I had open house from 4 to 6:30 for about 200 of our cousins and friends. And at that I remember, it was simply marvelous. You know, it was one of those beautiful, beautiful afternoons. And then we only had money to go to Atlantic City. I remember having that. And coming home, I think we had about $10 left. But it was the most wonderful marriage that anyone could have had. It was perfect. And I have only wonderful memories of the early years, and then on to Baldwin Avenue. First it was Simona was born. She was part of that, living in that apartment.
What street did you live on?
Clinton Avenue.
Oh, you're on.
506 Clinton. Corner of Chadwick. Second floor.
Poppy had his office after that. And when we had to separate, I moved to Baldwin Avenue. That was 19 Baldwin Avenue.
She means separate the office and
From the house, yeah.
Yeah, well, she understands. We didn't separate.
Right.
Poppy didn't like it. He just hated it. Jack hated it. So we had a chance to look at this Shanley Avenue house. And we rented. It was cheaper for us to rent it than...
Shanley Avenue? That's how you got there?
It was during the Depression, and it was a very bad time. But we rented it because it really, he didn't like that. He had the feeling of 3 years living together, having home and office. And then we moved to Shanley Avenue finally.
Grandma, what was the rent on Shanley Avenue in those years?
I think we paid $125
a month.
Well, that was in a third, you know.
It was also a lot of money.
Yeah.
That was a 12 room house.
Don't forget, we had a big house, we had a 12-room house. And that
And
was...
where were Grandpa and Grandma at this time? Did they...
No,
move in?
they had their own place.
Okay.
Grandma and
And
Grandpa.
Simona was
You must
born?
remember, Simona and Naomi were both... Naomi was 2 years old, and you were 5 when we moved to and
To Shanley Avenue.
To Shanley Avenue. So they both had... I think they had both... I don't know where you had the first one. You were probably in the same room together.
Yes.
And then we had the third floor, was their playroom.
Right.
They had these 3 huge rooms, or 2 huge rooms.
And then the little room, which was the long...
That was
naked
small,
lady
that was
And then it was my playroom.
And that was the bedroom, same as your bedroom, right above it.
Well, Grandma and Grandpa came to live with us when I was 11 years old.
Yes, when Noah was what?
4.
I remember you weren't in school yet, and I would get a call when my father's help didn't come, my mother couldn't move, and I ran with Noah to my mother's, took care of that, was running Shanley Avenue.
When did Grandma get sick?
Oh, she was in her early 40s when she started. She was already crippled when she's in her late 40s. She's using, what do you call it?
Canes, crutches?
Not canes, but, crutches. And all I can remember, she always had that. I think when she was blood poisoned, something happened to her whole system. And she had many things happen during the period where she didn't feel well. And all David remembers is my mother having the towel across her head. He doesn't remember her in any way that Joey remembers her, I remember her. And I've talked about him. has fond memories of my father, but he doesn't discuss my mother because he can't get very far with me on that. But
Did she complain though?
she never was too much of a complainer.
She was a real non-complainer.
The
No,
reason
no,
I ask
Grandma
that
didn't-
is
no,
that
Grandma
it seems
didn't.
to me that the family never complained.
No,
Yeah,
no.
she was a
No.
stoic.
Very
My
stoic.
mother was unbelievable what she suffered. I know that I have trouble with my shoulders, and I think of what I have, and I think of her whole body being full of rheumatoid. I don't know. She was unbelievable. The way she was so wonderful that she had people visiting her. They asked Sadie, "How are you?" And she said, "Fine." And the next thing they were giving her, telling them their troubles, and she was helping them.
Was
And
she your inspiration then for never complaining and
No, she never
always
did.
being strong? And
She never complained. She was always. Don't forget, it wasn't easy being crippled the way she was. Having run a house and having everybody come suddenly, she's bedridden, or practically bedridden.
My grandma had a lot of visitors all during that illness. I remember streams of
She had people.
walking up and down the stairs.
Oh, she had a lot of
She
people.
really was a non-complainer, and people loved to come and visit her. She had 3 girlfriends that came
Regularly.
every week to see her.
And then she had.
For all the years, I guess.
And then she had. Oh, I got to tell you something which I didn't tell you in the early part. Tante Camareza had a family. Had an older daughter.
Excuse me, who's Tante Hamareza?
That was an older aunt. That
What
was
a wonderful
Silly
name.
Watton's mother.
So this was Grandma's older sister?
Sister. Yes, she was very much older. Don't forget, Celie had older brothers that were older than my mother. Older than my mother, and I had cousins that were older than myself. So the whole way down both sides. This cousin of mine was what we would call a lady of the night.
Oh, every family does
I
have
think
at least
she was.
one.
I think she was a courtesan.
Yes, she was, but
She was not a prostitute.
But at that time, we and my parents were the only ones in our household accepted her. My father and mother never turned her away. And through all the years, when my mother was ill, she used to come from New York once a week and spend the whole day with my mother. She never forgot my mother and father, how wonderful they were. We were never taught, that's how we grew up, to accept what was going on in the world. We were never taught to say, oh, that was a terrible person, they did this, that you shouldn't be part of it. We never didn't even know what she was doing.
They were very liberal and amazingly sophisticated people.
Listen, I grew up,
See, that's how my vision of them, and even of my own father, is and Aunt Lila for sure, and you. I mean, everybody to me was very, as you say, sophisticated.
Yes, we were.
Very non-judgmental about that which others did, and
I
it's
never
something that
have
I'm
been.
very grateful, because I feel that I'm that way, and I'm very grateful to my family for having
given you
that.
that. And I think that's a part that I am grateful for, because I came down from my parents. They were always the steadfast couple for all their nieces and nephews. When the parents, when one went on eloped, and the parents wouldn't accept, so they came to my mother and father. It was a constant. Our home had that open attitude. We didn't know this one did something wrong, this didn't do something wrong. They were people. You accepted people.
You know, this went beyond just being the first stopping off point when the people came from Europe, when they sent their children
This was
over.
after my mother and father were married.
And then this went on for years, where many people stayed weeks, months, so forth. In the later years, as a youngster, I remember the family just being there. Cousins, Harry and Louis Catchin.
That's right.
And the
Oh, my
Ogans.
father spoke of them often.
Yeah, I mean, these were people were there every single day of the week.
And people would arrive from far points. I mean,
Like
we were
Chicago.
the eastern terminus for both sides of the family.
I had
So
this,
the
my
people were
father's
there
sister
from
was one who came
Chicago, from Nashville,
from, yes, all over.
Texas, from California, and they all stayed with us.
Mother, who was the cousin from North Carolina? He was a David Levy also, wasn't he?
He was South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Charlottesville, okay, I think it's that. He was, Dave Levy was the son of Simon.
Oh.
And a very interesting thing I've got to bring up, when my father, in 1919, my father decided to take a trip to see his brothers. Now this one brother he'd never seen. He was born after this brother had left, or the two brothers had left. And he went to Texas. And while he was getting ready to go, he got word that his brother in California had died, Daniel. Daniel he had seen, but Simon he had never seen. So he came down, he took Joey, your father, he was 7 years old that time, and they took him, and they went to Dallas first, and they visited with Simon, and it must have been a wonderful, wonderful meeting, the two brothers seeing each other after 30 years, not knowing him. This was 30 years older than he was. And then they went on to Chicago to see Yenna and her family. He would have gone on to California, but that had to change. It's a very fascinating thing. They always took Joey because he was the youngest. And we had enough trouble. That was the time when they were on that trip. My brother went sledding when he should not have gone, and he broke a front tooth.
Oh.
We talked about that.
Yeah.
It was really a wonderful time. My parents really trusted us. It was amazing going away like that. My sister was, well, Joey was 7, so she was 19. No, 16. She was 16. And I was 14, and Dave was 1.
You know what I always consider amazing about you, that as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter, with all those things which you did, as an aunt, as you were to me, and I would come with my God's friends on Sunday after I would swim. With all that, you maintained your identity as a woman, with your own interests.
This was very...
really when it wasn't necessarily the time that women did that.
Well, I happen to have been very lucky having a husband like Jack. He admired anything I did. And he always was there to say, do it if you want to do it. Never said, oh, maybe the children being neglected. That was never a thought. He knew that I would see that the household ran, but I would have to have this time for myself. And he was very supportive. And he was one of the early livers, and I was one of the independent women.
When did you start with your I
did a lot of singing before that. I did a lot of singing all around for many, many years. I did it free. I gave it as my part of charity to organizations. And if I wasn't to, say, like Hadassah or somebody, Jewish group, I would get paid and then give it to either Hadassah or one of the others. For many years. When I was in my late 40s, I had always wanted to do something with the arts. I knew that something was in me, and I remember walking with my friend Margaret down Atlantic City. We had gone away for a few days together. And I said, Margaret, there's something I have to do. I hope I find out what I want to do. So they had some classes at the Columbia High, and they had one in sculpture. So I took this class.
Wasn't the teacher a cousin?
It was Annie, what do you call it? Spindler's husband. And I did the first piece. I had my first piece that I did. And he said to me, you know, you're talented. And from then on, I bought clay, and I made heads of Jack.
I have.
You have.
I have one little one.
You have a wooden head. That was my second piece of wood, and that had a termite in it.
Yeah,
you see this?
Yeah.
And I remember this little termite had made a hole all the way in.
It looks like an Indian. It's neat.
Yeah. I remember having this need to go, and I got clay, and I used to make head size. I made a head of Jack that was just, I put glasses on it just looked like him. But what it was all solid clay, so it disintegrated. My sister said, I think we better go and find out about what you're doing. So we went to the Columbia University, to the art department. And we talked to the man there, and he said, I don't think you would find working here good. He said, you need to be free. He said, you don't want to be told to do something modern or something classic or something. You go in a place. So he suggested the Clay Club on 8th Street in New York. And I went down and was interviewed, and they accepted me, and I worked there. I was, or started there. There were famous names of people, art stuff working there. We never had a tutor. We worked, and then they would come around and suggest certain things. They never told you do this or do that. He really was a help to me like nobody else.
You want to turn it on?
And it,
Simona?
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about my Uncle Joey.
good.
He was 15 when I was born, so my earliest recollections of him, he was only a teenager himself. He was also absolutely the most handsome man you can
Yes.
ever imagine. Maybe the most handsome man I really ever knew when he was a young man. And he was absolutely ideal uncle. He adored us. We could do no wrong. He indulged us. And somehow he managed us very well at
He
the
sure
same
did.
time. He also was so glamorous to us. I mentioned before, he had a car with a rumble seat. But he would always arrive at the house sort of in a car with a rumble seat, usually with a gorgeous girl next to him. His girlfriends were really beautiful. And he was almost a movie star kind of figure in my life, besides being my uncle who I loved and who was there all the time. And I remember very well when he got married. He had met Sophie. And she was pretty young herself. And she was going to college.
That's right.
And I remember that she interviewed me because she had to do, I guess, a project for school. And she did an IQ test. And the result was that it turned out that I wasn't dumb. So that was a nice thing to know, although I don't think I was ever told what the score was. But that's the first thing I remember about her. And I remember the wedding very, very well.
Oh, yes.
And
So do I.
Tell your part, Noah, then.
I was the ring bearer at the wedding, and I used to practice on the 3rd floor in Shanley Avenue, carrying the ring back and forth on the pillow. And Uncle Nat, who somehow came into the picture about that time, Joey's friend, right, used to bribe me. And I used to get, at that time, I believe, it might have been a nickel, but somehow I think it was a quarter, to practice carrying this back and forth. And I remember being part of this ceremony, and then I had this recollection of being taken home because I was too young to stay for the party. But they dressed me up in a funny little suit, and I carried the ring down, and I was very disappointed because I had practiced this whole time to be able to carry the ring and not drop it, and they pinned it on. So I was devastated. Things they do to the tiny little boys.
Yeah, cool.
That was a wonderful time.
Mom, what do you remember about the wedding?
Pretty much that. And then I remember that
Why don't you sit next to Mother?
Uncle Joey and Aunt Sophie and the whole family used to gather at our house, 99 Shanley Avenue, Newark, New Jersey. It was a beautiful...
Bigelow 34059.
Bigelow 34059, the only phone number that I've ever been able to remember. It was a beautiful Victorian home, 12 rooms, carved doors, leaded glass windows, stained glass, beautiful touches. But more than that, it was a gathering place for the family, both sides of the family. Lisa remembers, I remember, Kathy, I'm sure, still has some memories of it, particularly of the dining room, which was physically a very beautiful room with stained glass French windows and a black metal Italian chandelier. But what we all remember is sitting around the table and the feeling of family sitting around the table. And I know that that was an education for me. The family was, they were all strong characters. They there wasn't anybody in my family who didn't have an opinion of his or her own. And I know that for myself, no one said to me, now Simona dear, what do you think? You had to get in there. This is where I learned to speak up.
I have a story about that. My mother once told me she was in the family for 2 years before she realized when you say, excuse me, no one stops talking.
Every one of us has learned that as part of survival.
You know, it's fascinating. Everybody had so much to say. They all were so dynamic, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And the discussions that took place around that table were interesting. It wasn't only family stuff. It was art, it was music, it was politics, it was what was going on in the world. And it included all of the generations. As children, we really were included in this as far as we could participate. So that we heard all of these discussions. And I think that Risa was talking about every one of us has an interest in art and music and politics. And maybe that's one of the places where we began to take this in almost with our mother's milk.
It's as much a part of life as
Well,
it is life.
This was all part of it. We always had, besides family, we always had very interesting people coming to our home. And Simona and Noah will remember the Arab that was invited to speak at the temple next door. And the children were all three were very disappointed because he didn't come in his Arab regalia. He came as an ordinary dress. But that was a very fascinating night because there was a debate. This goes back a long time when they were very young, and talking about the Arab Israel and Palestine. And I think Rabbi, what was Rabbi there?
Prince.
No.
Prince.
Prince.
Rabbi Prince.
He was simply marvelous. The Arab gave certain things and Prince answered him. It was the most wonderful, exciting evening. This was just one of the evenings we had of different things that came up. Remember, Noah, you remember when Zilla and
Sylvan Cone.
Sylvan Cone came and they brought some subject up and you ran upstairs to talk to them find a certain item.
In Ripley's Believe It or Not, that about this story of the Kohanim, the Cohens, that they were all of the priestly.
The priests.
And I came downstairs with that, and everyone stopped and listened. But as youngsters, I'm sure Simona remembers being upstairs on the second floor in Shanley Avenue and sitting close to the railing to overhear what was going on downstairs in the dining room.
I also remember another room in the house very well, and that room was the room with the piano, which was the living room. And the reason I remember that so well is that all of my memories of childhood, there is a musical background, and that was the sound of my mother singing, and people singing along with her. And I can remember falling asleep to that sound very often. That was also a part of family life.
That was part of, I think, at the time, friends gathered, and we would play the piano and we would sing, and it was storytelling and all that. But I always remembered that because it was so much a part of our living. It was so natural for us. And for me, there were many days when the household was more than I could stand. I would go upstairs, close the doors. Luckily, we had 2 rooms, my bedroom and living room connected. We could close them off. I would sit down and play the piano and sing. Just by myself, didn't want anybody in the room, just to get myself collected already.
Connected to
and
sense.
get back. And I ran a very busy household.
You want to move over?
Yeah. Don't forget, there was the office, there was my mother and father, there was my 3 children, and there was our own lives to think about. Jack and I had to have a certain life too. We tried to separate that. It wasn't easy. It took a long time. When Jack said to me after 7 years, he said, I never realized how many personalities you have to put up with. He said, to keep that upstairs separated from this floor, from that floor. He said, it took a great deal. Well, I knew that it was up to me to do it.
It was a very interesting situation when you look at family dynamics, and I'm sure Simona can probably even give greater insight, how my father had to be the father to us and had to be the husband to my mother, but my grandfather, who was my mother's father, had to have a certain equal role, so they could not be subservient. We had to have two equals among men there, which is extremely difficult in any circumstances.
And what I did, I put my father at one end of the table and Jack at the other, and I sat inside. So each one had an equal
You made a
position.
statement by their
Absolutely. I
location.
didn't make any point. My father sat here, my father sat nothing. This took a great deal. It took a great deal on my part to separate certain things. I had to separate that from my children's lives. They learned, they gathered a great deal from my parents, but I had to be on a level with them, give them what was due them, and then also help Jack with his office. I was part of that whole thing, plus doing my father's books at the time.
A wonderful story that gets us back to the dining room, and Risa may have been here at that time. I don't see why not, because it happened at many holidays. My father, who was religious in his own way, he was not kosher, he was not traditional,
That's
but
right.
had a great reverence for the religion and a great
Simone,
belief
I would-
in God.
I would say, yes, I agree there, but I would think that Dad was a traditionalist in that he observed the holidays as a family holiday rather than something that was done in the temple.
Yes. Daddy had great connection, though, to the whole kind of center idea
Yes.
of Judaism. And there was my grandfather, who was very learned, but an avowed atheist. My father would wait until there were at least 40 people at the table at a very important holiday like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or Passover, at which time he would turn to my grandfather and he would say, "And to my father-in-law, I give the honor of saying the first bracha." Now, what could my grandfather do? He certainly was not going to rise to the occasion. So, reluctantly, but eventually with grace, he would say the first blessing.
But he did it. It was.
Oh, yes.
It was a time that I had to be between two personalities. Luckily, Jack was much more pliant. Jack had a sweetness and a kindness and a respect for my father. So in many things, he sort of didn't give in, but he felt it wasn't important, so he didn't.
Well, I always felt that my Uncle Jack, and to this day, in my thinking of him, I think of him as the sweetest, kindest
He adored
man
you.
I've ever known.
He
Truthfully,
adored you.
I've never known.
He just adored you.
I loved him. He always called me Pussycat. Maybe he called everybody else that too. I don't know. But I remember one time sitting in the dental chair, and really a great compliment to him is when I moved away and would go to another dentist, and people say, as an adult, they say, "Do you have a fear of the dentist?" It never occurred to me to have a fear of the dentist. How could I possibly be afraid of my Uncle Jack, who was this wonderful person? One time I was acting very badly, and I remember Uncle Jack's sister was sitting on the front porch. So I'm sure I really embarrassed him in some way, but
He didn't get embarrassed by
I
this
was
sister.
carrying on just something awful. I think my mother left me there in order to go shopping, and I guess I didn't want any part of that. And I was acting out, I don't know, I was probably older than I want to remember, but I was acting out
About
in some
18.
way. It was probably 18 and carrying on and throwing a fit. And he just smiled, and he just kept smiling at me in such a loving way that I knew there was really no reason for this nonsense, and I stopped it. You know, it was just such a wonderful memories that I have of him.
He also had a wonderful way with young children. They would come, he would say to the mothers, when you come here, bring them. And he would show them all the things that he was doing.
Special man.
And then when they came, he would sit them down and he would not start to work right away like a lot of dentists. He would talk to them. He would go through a certain routine, so they were so relaxed. And when he was doing, he would say, "Now this will hurt."
He said, just a light touch, just a little
This
light
will
touch.
hurt.
He said, a little
So
light. He never gave us no cane.
when Jack became president of the Newark Dental Club in 1927 and remained very active in many areas for years, he was one of the early group to give his time to the Beth Israel Hospital Dental Clinic. In fact, it started a few years before Daddy joined. He remained an active dentist at the clinic for over 40 years. He was the editor of the Essex County Dental Society Monthly. Simona will remember counting words for columns, for the columns. He was very active in Zionist organizing. He was president of the Jewish Education Society of Essex County. Jack became president of Newark Dental Club when we were married a year. Jack was asked to speak to Jewish and dental groups. He had fine speaking voice. He loved going into junk shops and other places, looking for bronzes and other things of interest. He had a dry sense of humor and enjoyed his own jokes to the fullest, laughing before he finished a joke. He was a fine, dedicated dentist, loved by his patients, and an asset to his profession. Jack had an inquisitive mind, and books were his hobby. He was gentle and very thoughtful. Jack wrote many articles and interesting columns for the Newark Dental Club and others. People trusted him as he was honest and straightforward. Jack was truly happy when he heard that others were successful, and he admired scholarship. He was an unusual father, a wonderful husband and grandfather. He was a romantic. He loved poetry and read it all the time. There is so much to say about Jack. He was unusual in many unusual man, and family was very important to him. Education a must. He was interested in the education of his faith, and was not dogmatic. At the dinner we had, he would always throw out an interesting idea and conversation would start. There were jokes, fun, but serious thought too. He loved to sit at the table at holidays and see his dear family surround him, and he was so proud of all of you. He had a curious and inquiring mind, always listened. He loved to do everything interesting. He was a reserved person in a group, but then when he was with people he knew, he was outgoing. Jack was a romantic man, wrote the most wonderful notes to me on the 4th of each month for many years, and it was always remained a special day for us. I'm happy we've had the years together and the many trips we were able to share. The memories are beautiful, but are always missing. He would have been so proud of the young people that joined our family. Now, with the coming of our great-great-grandchildren, he would have been so happy. I know, having lived to have a dear Ross and a dear little Naomi has been a blessing for me. I am very, very thankful. These beautiful children have added so much to me, to our life, and to our lives, and to mine in particular. Hanukkah 1990 was, no, that's another part.
Oh,
Okay.
Wonderful, Mother.
wonderful.
Mom, we'll have to do this again so you can read the rest of those wonderful stories to us.
Well, there is a lot of wonderful stories in here that I feel tells about. In fact, I go along from the time you were little, going along as you're going into high school and as you go on to college, and how each thing happened. And I think this is something that has to be read too.
Look, there's another thing called Anna's Journal.
I'd love that. I'd love
That would
that.
be nice.
Risa, I think that from the beginning, the Alpha to the Omega, we are.
Yes.
Will you please tell us the
These
significance?
are these I brought with because they were given to me by my mother, and they were given to her by her mother-in-law.
My mother loves your mother.
And they are candlesticks that I do light every Friday night and have for many, many years. So why don't we light them?
Also, yes.
Well, it's just something that I thought would be so nice to
say
have
something to
all
light.
of Sadie and Louie's children and grandchildren here to just light the candles together
then Joey
in
should
a
be
nice
in this
way.
shot.
And I like Joey here too.
Come
Joey,
here, Joey.
we need you in one shot, honey.
Come on in and sit next to her. Let's see, we can't get, you have to get everyone very, very close.
This is my honor, dear, to have you near me.
Kathy,
My
Come really close,
this
though.
is the grandnephew.
this is, these are your great grandmother's, Sadie's
I've been in this
candlesticks.
room.
And everybody in this room are the children and grandchildren of this woman. So you being the youngest, would be nice if you light the candle.
And we can also blessing together.
Say a blessing.
It'll be for Yom Tov. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivonu l'hadlik ner shel Yom Tov. Because any time the family gets together, it's a holiday. It is a Yom Tov.
We see you.
Thank you, Joey.
And
Thank you.
I am so delighted to have done this, and thank you so much for the time and all my family to be with me and to be with you with this. You know, maybe there's just one thank you. What I was thinking of how I would like to end this is if you were to thank your parents for one of your wonderful qualities, what would you say as a thank you to your parents? Because we can all thank you for that quality as well.
for being the people that they were, being honest, forward, and thinking, and allowing us to be independent people.
I think that's a wrap.
Until next time.
Until next time, and when we do part 2, Ernest Journal.